everybody. Al Bernstein here with another one of our Boxing Hangouts. And this one is one we've looked forward to for weeks, no, make that months. We've been talking for a while about doing a Boxing Hangout in which we get a chance to really explore the guidelines and issues related to performance-enhancing drugs in boxing, and in fact, generally just the guidelines of how whatever materials boxers put into their body are adjudicated by the various commissions and the testing bodies as well. Dan Parks, of course, the producer of the Hangouts, and Dan, you've been working diligently to make this happen, and in a moment we're going to interview our special guest, but this is an issue that is important, not for boxing, for mixed martial arts as well, any combat sports. The question of performance-enhancing drugs becomes much more important, doesn't it?
As every day goes by, and by the way, just let me say ahead of time that just having this this fabulous lady on, look at what's happened to my body almost immediately. And I swear it's all natural. It's all natural.
You can tell us you have done nothing to enhance that tremendous muscle growth.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled that we're going to have what we're doing today. This is going to be fantastic.
We're going to have a great time here today, and we hope we're going to be doing some things that are educational to all of you, and we will learn. I will certainly learn, and all of you will learn as we have this conversation. And who is the mentor today to talk to us? Well, she's a wonderful lady who I've known for many, many years, and she is a former ring physician with the Nevada State Athletic Commission. She's a practicing neurologist in Las Vegas, and more importantly, recently has become the head of VADA, a group of that educates and will do testing on athletes in terms of the drugs or other materials they may put in their body. Her name is Margaret Goodman, and Margaret, we are so delighted to have you visit with us today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to finally be here.
I know, this is great, and we've got so many different things to talk about, not just things about the question of all these issues of performance-enhancing drugs in boxing, but also some things I want to enlighten people about you, which we're going to get to in a little bit. You are not only a practicing physician and not only involved in the sport of boxing in terms of its safety and all the rest, but you are also a novelist, and we're going to talk a little bit in a little while about your novel, Death in Vegas, which I will tell people right at the beginning I found to be absolutely delightful and fascinating. You wrote about topics that you threw into it, as people often do in their novels, especially first novels. You wrote about things you understood, which they say is the key to writing a good novel, so that you know you can do it. Before we get into all our other topics, what prompted you to write a novel?
You know, when I left the Athletic Commission, there were a lot of things I wanted to see change, and to write a tell-all book, unless I was Al Bernstein, probably no one would read it. So I figured that this was probably the best way to approach it, was through a novel. And I also wanted to get people that really didn't have much experience with boxing, maybe even wouldn't watch a fight, that would maybe learn something and fall in love with the sport as I had for so many years.
All right, we'll get back to the novel a little bit later, but go on Amazon.com, buy Death in Vegas. It's a it's a great read, and it's interesting. It's suspenseful. It's humorous in part, and very, very good read. Now, you spent your time, for over a decade, you were one of the physicians that served as a ringside doctor for the Nevada State Athletic Commission. That was so you had a unique vantage point to see fighters as they fought, as they got ready for fights. You reviewed their medical records before. I would think all of that has to be invaluable to you in the work you're doing now with VADA.
You know, it is. It's funny, Al, because when we would see a fighter at a weigh-in, and you know the weigh-ins, you've seen how quick they go, and you really only have a couple minutes to examine a fighter. And I remember when they would fill out their forms and write down, you know, what medicine they've been on, etc. And there would often be fighters that would write down that they were using a lot of aspirin or naproxen anti-inflammatories. And I would only have a few seconds to ask them, but I would ask them if they understood the side effects of those drugs, because, you know, when you're getting hit in the head, the last thing you want to do is be on something that will make you bleed. You know, they pay all this money to these cut men to work in the corner, but yet here you have all these fighters using all these anti-inflammatories that are going to really be counterproductive to having a cut man work on a nosebleed or an eye cut, or even predispose them to a brain bleed. So, you know, it kind of started there, where I started to see that fighters really weren't being educated enough, you know, that they want to know. They would ask the questions, but they really didn't have anybody to talk to about these things.
And so that led you to, Evelyn, you left your role as ring doctor. You helped form an organization called VADA, and let's show people what that's all about. And they can go to the VADA website. They can get information, as fighters can. This organization, put VADA in a nutshell in terms of what it's designed to do, what its goals are, and where you think it's headed.
Well, bottom line is, the other thing that I learned very quickly towards the end of my tenure with the Athletic Commission was that fighters were using all kinds of drugs. And they often didn't know what those drugs were doing to them. They were taking something that someone was giving them. Obviously, ultimately, it's their responsibility. But they were using as many performance-enhancing drugs as were being used in other sports, like cycling. Right. And the fighters weren't being educated about that. And also, the other bad part, which you're probably so aware of, is that most commissions weren't even doing any testing of the athletes, let alone education of the athletes. And so it was this huge problem. And I think it's always so funny that people, especially even athletic commissions, this one in Nevada is a prime example, that they weren't thinking fighters were using these kinds of drugs, which is ridiculous. Why wouldn't they? Right. Fighters are probably smarter than many other athletes and many other aspects out there. They really knew that these were things that were going to benefit them, but they didn't understand the negative. And if a commission isn't testing for these things, then how can you say they're not using them? So
yeah, it's a very good point. So VADA, you guys have your website, which people can go to, and the fighters can go to get information. And do you have an outreach to the fighters as well to give them information on what's best for them to use?
You know, any fighter can contact us, even their trainer. It's all free. We're happy to point them in the right direction, understand potential side effects of these substances, understand if something they're taking could be prohibited. You know, the other thing that you know, maybe we won't have time to get into is supplements. You know, every fighter is taking some kind of supplement, and maybe probably a long list of supplements. And a lot of those contain prohibited substances, dangerous substances. Some of them are tainted with substances that are illegal or dangerous, and the fighters don't even know about that. So we're happy to help point them in the right direction for that. We're always happy to talk to trainers. I just came back from the Association Boxing Commission meeting, where we were trying to educate the commissions to expand their testing, and also help the fighters know what is a problem. So I think that there has to be that communication.
First of all, how widespread in the sport of boxing do you think that performance-enhancing drugs has been or is at the moment? Is it on a par with all other sports? Has it gone beyond? What would be your general impression? You
know, obviously I'm talking at the top of my head because I don't think anybody knows.
These are anecdotal.
But you know, one thing, when I left the Athletic Commission too, and I was still writing for Ring Magazine, and I would interview fighters and trainers, I think it's really widespread. I think it's just like any other sport. I think it's just like college sports. You know, it was funny, I had a patient the other day who I see for a seizure disorder. I see him about once a year. big guy, but I never really asked him what his amateur experience was, or if he was a pro for a while. And he was coming in for his yearly visit, and he said to me, "Doc, do you think I got this seizure disorder because I fried my brain with all the anabolic steroids I took?" And I'm going, whoa, wait a minute. What were you taking and when? And then he happened to go into this amazing story when he was with an NCAA football team as a linebacker. And he said, I came out of high school, I was 260 pounds, I thought I was going to really pound these other guys. He says, I get on the field my first day, and they knocked me unconscious. And he said, the coach then said, come here, son, let me explain how this needs to work. And he said, within a week, he said, they loaded all of us on a bus, and they drove us to Tijuana. And in Tijuana, they purchased for us a whole bunch of anabolic steroids, and he says other stuff that I didn't know. And he said for all of my college career, they had me on 4 anabolic steroids.
Oh, my.
And he said my coach, interestingly enough, would take us in the locker room, and he'd put up a poster of Mountain Dew. And he said, this is what's in Mountain Dew. This is what Mountain Dew will do to you. And then he'd show another poster of a group of different steroids. And he'd say, this is what's good for you.
Oh.
And then the sad thing that's even sadder after that is after he played football for a long time, he did play, or he became a mixed martial artist. And he didn't do too much in that, but he said, interestingly enough, they no longer put him in a bus to Tijuana, but they took him to an anti-aging clinic.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
I know.
How many, that's fascinating. How many fighters reach out to VADA now? And do you guys have to actively, spreading the word to fighters obviously is important, into the trainers and to the promoters and whatever. And are you getting an increase in numbers of fighters in their camps that are coming to you?
The hard part is financial, because a lot of fighters, as you know, some of these young guys coming up, they're making a couple $100 a round.
Right.
And we've been contacted probably by over 100 fighters that would like to not just test with us, but also want the information. So we're happy to give them all the information. I wish that we had more fighters test with us, but you know what? The program really isn't about testing. It's really about the education part. So that's one thing that we're going to hopefully be working with the WBC on. We're right now putting together a webinar that will not only show from beginning to end how fighters are tested for blood and urine, but it's also going to educate them on what are performance-enhancing drugs, what may be, what could be in supplements, and so provide that educational aspect. So yeah, fighters reach out to us all the time, as do trainers, and ask questions. They can even do it anonymously. It's not like this is a show and tell here. This is really just to give them that information. We also, what's very interesting that I don't think anyone else has, is we have a program where we can refer them if they have a history of substance abuse, either alcohol, drugs, or performance-enhancing drugs. We have a way to refer them. There's a group out there you may have probably haven't heard of. It's called Athletes Recovery. It was started by a former pro football player, and it's out of Texas, and they have a whole facility that even has a boxing ring, has all kinds of trainers there, and it's almost like a Betty Ford Center for substance abusers. And so fighters can go there, as well as many other athletes. They've got, amateur pro athletes there, and so they can kind of recover there and get the help that they need. So we try to help benefit that organization as well.
To get us into some of the specifics, I'm going to bring in Dan Parks, who has, I know, been waiting for this opportunity to ask you a bunch of questions. Don't feel like you're on Face the Nation, Margaret, but Dan, who's very knowledgeable, has a lot of questions to ask you.
I will give you my server. If you want my server, I will give it to you.
Dan's a guru on many things, including the internet, but Dan, I know you have a number of things that you want to get into with Margaret. Fire away.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to get right to something specific. And right after the biggest boxing match of the millennium, the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight, there was all those conversations about whether somebody was injured, he wasn't injured, which is neither here nor there. Our friend Paulie Malignaggi had a great video where he was talking about cortisone, and when what Pacquiao was requesting, which was a shot, and Pauly said that when most people get shots or request a shot, they get a cortisone shot, and Pacquiao had requested something called Toradol. Now, I had never heard of Toradol before, and immediately I went and Googled it and learned, and apparently it makes you aggressive, and it numbs impact. And I think Pauly said something about they give it to linebackers and football players. So immediately I went, wow, I never even heard of this before. And if I've never heard of this, first of all, can you tell us more about Toradol? And are there other things that people that are not being tested for that have that kind of an effect?
Well, here's the thing: it brings up so many different topics, and it's hard to be specific. But there are lawsuits going on, or there have been, from former NFL players regarding Toradol, because I think some of them were given Toradol injections before they went out to play a game, and they believed that maybe it was contributory to brain injury. You know, there's all those lawsuits that some have been settled as far as chronic traumatic encephalopathy in football players, Junior Seau, that one gentleman I think that was just put in the Hall of Fame, that these drugs can, anything that numbs you or makes it so that you don't feel pain, or anything that gets you out to play can be a problem, because anytime you're falsely covering up an injury, you're going to be predisposed to another injury, you know, and that's why all this is going on in horse racing as far as performance enhancing drugs. So yeah, Toradol is a very strong anti-inflammatory. Once again, like we were talking about earlier, as far as aspirin and naproxen, it can predispose you to bleeding, but it also is something that can predispose someone to kidney stones. So it's not really good in a fighter that could be predisposed to dehydration, either cutting weight. So it's not the ideal substance that I would want a fighter to take. But once again, anytime a fighter is taking something before a fight, they have to clear that with the athletic commission, irrespective of being in any kind of a testing program, or whether or not it's an approved substance from a testing organization, or it's under some code, etc. They really have to get permission from the athletic commission to use it.
Excellent.
Maybe this is a good time to bring in those rules from the Nevada State Athletic Commission, because Margaret was referencing them, and I'll let you get back to your questioning a little bit, but let's take a look at that if we can. And Margaret, maybe you can highlight, these are rules that the Nevada State Athletic Commission believe they strengthened a bit in recent times. It's for boxing, of course, for mixed martial arts as well. Maybe as you look at that, because you alluded to it, you can point to some of the things that are specific, that are, and what they're designed to do in terms of preventing people from using performance-enhancing drugs.
You know, here's the thing. With any kind of suspension or penalty, you're trying to, as far as drugs are concerned, not medical issues, but as far as drugs are concerned, or performance-enhancing methods are concerned, you know, and that includes things like IV fluids, which you might want to talk about, or blood doping, etc., is that it's supposed to be a deterrent. My thing is, whether you believe in the death penalty or not, I don't know if the death penalty has really cut down on the murder rate. So I see what they're trying to do. I don't have a huge problem with extending penalties, but to me, this is professional boxing and professional MMA. What are we trying to do with an anti-doping program? Are we trying to end fighters' careers, or are we trying to stop usage and promote clean sport? And hopefully with some of the extended penalties that they're implementing, especially as it pertains to things like anabolic steroids, that it will help stop usage. But, you know, what's the mentality of an athlete? You know, if you look at some of these other athletes that cheated, you know, I read a book by Tyler Hamilton, a former Tour de France cyclist. It was a fascinating book. I really recommend it. I don't usually read things like that. But he goes through step by step what he abused. And, of course, he obviously implicates Lance Armstrong. He wrote this book before Lance Armstrong was on Oprah. But the bottom line is, you really look at what an athlete is willing to do to win. And I don't know, time will tell whether or not these extended deterrents and suspensions that athletic commissions are implementing, like Nevada and California, is that going to stop usage, or whether or not someone wants to win at any cost and is willing to take the risk. You can implement penalties like they're having for things like diuretics, which I really think are a little bit over the top. I think 4 years that is what WADA has gone to, which I know that some of the athletic commissions are trying to go towards. I don't really want to see a fighter's career end over this. I do want them to stop usage, and I think that implementing other penalties like demanding community service, demanding more frequent testing of them if they've been caught, is maybe a better way to go than 4 years ruining a kid's career. I mean, you and I both know, I mean, you take a professional fighter and you take them out for 4 years, what's going to happen to them? You know, the other thing that's been proven, and this is important, has been proven, is when you determine a fighter's fitness to compete, and this is one thing that I dealt with a lot when I was head of the medical advisory board in Nevada and reviewing fighter medicals, is the last thing you want is a fighter that hasn't competed for a long, long time. They're at increased risk of injury as much as somebody that fights too much. So I think you have to really look at that, and I think that it's important not to put the cart before the horse. When I spoke at the ABC a couple of days ago, one thing I recommended to them was, yeah, sure, expand your program, expand your length of suspensions if someone's positive, but the main thing is to educate these kids. A lot of them don't know what they're even going to be tested for. Right. They don't know, and it's not, you know, you have to have an element of fairness here. And so one thing that VADA does is we really have in-depth policies. One reason why we're putting together this webinar with the WBC is we want the fighters to understand what is a performance-enhancing drug, you know, why supplements are dangerous, what they can contain. And so I really think you have to look at it from that standpoint, you know, what someone may be giving you, what you're agreeing to take, and really start at the beginning. So don't put the cart before the horse and educate these kids, or the programs are really going to be useless.
Yeah, good point. Dan, I took the floor away from you. I'm throwing it back to you now.
No, okay. Well, I have a grand scheme because, you know, again, you're ahead of the curve of all of these issues, and I often wonder what would happen if we could actually get someone that has the big picture and put you in charge. So I wave a magic wand, and you are now the queen of all boxing, and you can set the rules, set up education, do anything that you want to fix all of boxing and MMA, combat sports, so it's fair and it's safe. What would be the first steps? What needs to happen in order to really make it safe for everybody and fair for everybody?
Okay, first off, I'm going to hire a very big bodyguard.
Several, maybe.
Number two, I'm going to have someone check my brakes every day and check the food I eat. Okay, that's rule number one. And probably Flip Homansky, my significant other, will take out a bigger life insurance policy on me. So that's what's first thing's going to happen.
That's great.
Number two, I want Dan's trainer and nutritionist so I can look like him.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm ready.
Look, number three, and first foremost, I mean, I think I've said this a multitude of times, and I know a lot of people don't agree with this, but first and foremost, we need to have a national body overseeing boxing and MMA. And, you know, I'd hoped a long time ago Senator McCain would do something, but that's just not going to happen in my lifetime. So, yeah, the problem is uniformity. So I think that if someone would put me in charge, which would never happen, but if someone would put me in charge, I would want to create uniformity. Uniformity on the rules, not on just drug testing, but uniformity on determining fitness to compete. I think that is probably first and foremost that really gets pushed aside when athletic commissions are licensing a fighter. It's very narrow-minded. You know, there's something called fight facts and the federal suspension list that lists when a fighter, there's also the same thing for MMA now. It's a different company that does it, but there's something that lists all the suspensions for MMA fighters. And tells you where they fought, what weight they fought at, why they were given a suspension. So I think there needs to be shared information. You know, one thing that was discussed at the ABC was there was not nearly enough shared information between commissions. And one thing that contributes to not just chronic injury but acute injury in fighters, and it may not just be brain, it may be hand injuries, shoulder injuries, cut healing times, etc., is enough. There's not enough shared information. So there needs to be much more shared information between the commissions. Obviously, there needs to be advanced drug testing. You know, it really hurts me, even though we both are, I know that you're a horse lover, an equestrian, a prominent equestrian, but it hurts me to see that Congress is addressing drug testing and expanding drug testing in thoroughbred racing, but nobody is giving a hoot about what's going on in boxing and MMA. Yeah. So that hurts my soul to see that, although I'm really glad that they're doing that for the racehorses, because, oh my God, the amount of breakdowns that occur on the track are ridiculous. So I think that a lot of that's because, like you were talking with things like Toradol, there's other things they give horse races, race horses to cover up injuries. So that needs to happen. I think suspensions need to be much more uniform as far as what happens when some poor fighter in one of your fights, Al, is TKO'd or given a knockout. You know, one other interesting thing, at the ABC, they had this very prominent doctor, and I think his last name was Thompson. I can't remember what university he was affiliated with. He was talking about the need to help fighters recuperate from concussion. You know, right now what happens on the federal suspension list, they give them 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever, and then no one sees them again until they show up for another weigh-in. And nobody really knows if they've recovered or not. And so he came forth with this whole protocol that could be done cost effectively to help recuperate fighters from a concussion. But I think what it really amounted to is it was giving fighters more time off, because you probably see this countless times when you're sitting ringside. You see a fighter that maybe got back in the ring or got back in the gym too soon. So there needs to be standardization of that, and there needs to be just communication. You know, that's my biggest thing, is the commissions don't communicate with each other, and that's how fighters end up being injured, how they end up fighting too soon. And I think if there was that kind of communication, I think that would be astronomical in improving the sport. And so not so much being a big hammer coming down on these kids. Somebody needs to put together a program where they'll be educated more themselves, because fighters are smart. I mean, you know as well as I don't know, you know, you get in the ring, you've got to be a smart guy to be able, or smart woman to be able to compete in these sports. And so we need to trust the fighters more, that they can handle this information and make these decisions themselves. So that's where I would start.
I like that. Dan, you got one more?
Well, I think the next question I really wanted to know a little bit more about is blood boosters, EPO, transfusions. So those seem to be like the other things that can't be tested for, or are not being tested for currently. Are those all things going on rampantly, do you think, or is it?
I'll tell you a funny story, and I won't tell you who the fighter is, because that would implicate them, and it would be unfair. But I was worked a fight. I can't remember if it was at the MGM or Mandalay. It was a pretty big card, and we all kind of knew that it was a mismatch. You know, we could get into mismatches for hours here, but irrespective of that, it was a mismatch, and I was the chief doctor that night. And very quickly, as you would expect, it might have been a Showtime fight, actually. As you might expect, the person that we thought would won very quickly, knocked out the other kid within like 2 rounds. And before that fight, at the weigh-in, you know, and fighters will say something about their opponent. You hear that all the time. You hear it at the press conferences, the accusations that get thrown around. Was before the fight, one of the kid that got knocked out, one of his trainers said, "You know, the other guy is blood doping." And I looked at him and I thought, wow, you know, we weren't running blood counts back then. We couldn't do anything about that. And I thought, oh my God, I can't imagine that a fighter would blood dope. And this was, you know, maybe 12, 13 years ago. But sure enough, yeah, fighters are blood doping. They're blood doping rampantly. And how are they doing it? They're doing it the same way Lance Armstrong was doing it, and the cyclists were doing it, is they were either auto-transfusing their own blood. I don't know if any of you have ever had to have surgery where they asked you to take out a couple units of blood before you had your procedure, and then they would do that in case you're in the OR, you start bleeding out, they've got your own blood to retransfuse. So that's what athletes do all the time. And it's very hard to track unless you're following someone's blood count. You know, one thing that WADA has, or the World Anti-Doping Agency is now doing, is this thing called a biological passport, where they'll track hundreds or thousands of athletes, especially in cycling they're doing this. They'll track their blood count, and then they'll trace it over time so they can catch them if it looks like they've been transfusing their own blood. The other way that is very common, that I do believe is rampant in combat sports, is using drugs like EPO or erythropoietin. Anybody that's had cancer or has renal failure, there are drugs that they can give them either in an IV or injecting, even orally, to help stimulate your bone marrow to produce more blood cells. And you say, well, why? Who cares about that? Well, the more blood cells you have, the more oxygen you can carry in your system, the better your endurance is. It makes you feel like Superman. And I remember reading in Tyler Hamilton's book, he was talking about how when he started using EPO or doing transfusions, he'd feel like Superman. He could ride up any hill. And even, you know, people say, well, why would a fighter want a blood dope? Well, because it gives them more energy, more endurance. And whether it's a 6 round or it's a 12 round, it works. It works. But the problem is athletes don't really understand the repercussions of that. It contributes to stroke. It contributes to heart disease. It can contribute to liver disease, etc. And yes, I do believe it's rampant. And I do believe that athletes are using that and using it in IVs. And so when they're getting IVs maybe to rehydrate, or IVs during training, or somebody is saying this is B12 and they're not really sure what they're getting, they're using substances like EPO, and it's building their blood count. And how many commissions are checking for that? Almost none.
Right. Well, that was my next question, is nobody's testing for this? There isn't anything? You couldn't catch that in a post-fight urine test or blood test?
You can, but here's the thing, is, you know, when I developed our protocol for VADA, I went to Dr. Don Catlin. Dr. Don Catlin's our scientific advisor. He's considered by many the father of anti-doping, okay? He created one of the first WADA-accredited labs at UCLA, and he was the one that was involved in the Balco investigation, and he was the one that discovered the test for the designer steroid that caught those athletes from Balco. Dr. Catlin, I went to him even a couple years before I started VADA, and I said, what test should we do? And he said, Margaret, you know, you can do the typical WADA panel that they do on all the Olympic athletes, but that's not good enough. You need to add a couple different things. You need to add tests for EPO. And the test for EPO is a urine test, even though it catches blood doping. It's a urine test. And then he also told us that we needed to add this other test that, you know, we don't need to go into, or we can, called IRMS, or carbon isotope ratio testing, which has become the hot thing. And our organization tests that on every athlete that we test. So, yes, to answer your question, I'm sorry to be so long-winded.
No, that was great.
you can't catch someone if you don't do the right tests. So yeah, hardly any athletic commission is doing EPO testing on a routine basis. They should be doing it with every collection. But you can't test for synthetic EPO unless you send it to a WADA accredited lab. So that's the other thing, is it's not just the tests, it's the labs that the commissions aren't using. So yes, that was one thing I talked about at the ABC. You really have to get the basics done, or you're not going to catch people. Or you're not going to create a deterrent.
You know, part of what you're talking about here is interesting. As I'm listening to you, part of the issue is enforcement is difficult. So at the end of the day, we're back to your original point about education. If we can somehow get fighters to understand that, let's say, for instance, there are serious safety hazards to them when they're 35 or 40 or 50 years old, perhaps they'll be less willing to do it, even though the rewards are there. and more importantly, they'll at least have some clue about this. I'm listening to you talk about this, and some of it, of course, is cost factor as well. How
Yeah.
much of that plays into this? Because we're talking about governmental bodies who have limited resources. How much of the issue is monetary?
It's huge. It's huge for everything. You know, Al, when Flip and I started adding MRI testing, or we proposed MRI testing in Nevada, how many years ago? That was the big issue, was the cost. But just like everything, supply and demand, if you had all of these athletic commissions or more athletic commissions doing these tests, it would drive down the cost significantly. You know, if you look at the cost for the testing through VADA or USADA or Drug-Free Sports, some of these other entities that athletic commissions are using or that fighters are using, it's very expensive. It's, you know, to do these tests, to do a basic profile through a WADA accredited lab, just basic for steroids, for diuretics, for drugs of abuse, stimulants, all of those kind of things, it's really no more expensive than doing it at a regular lab like Quest or LabCorp. So that's important, and I explained that to the athletic commissions a couple days ago. When you start adding tests like erythropoietin, yeah, that may be a $150 test, or you're doing a test for growth hormone, it may be another $100. So it's hard for an undercard fighter to afford those things. But I think that athletic commissions are trying to find a way that it could be maybe taken out of ticket prices, or maybe promoters will get a write-off otherwise. Anybody that, for example, requests testing through VADA, we're a tax-deductible organization, a nonprofit. We don't take any administrative fees, so the only thing a fighter is ever being charged for, the promoter is being charged for, is the actual testing and the collection. The problem with collections is, if you looked at, for example, like the Ryan Braun situation in baseball and some of these other instances where drug offenses have been overturned, it often relates to the collection. So one thing that we offer the highest skilled collection company, Claridium, to collect for us all over the world. You know, they collected Manny Pacquiao, Nonito Donaire, they collected in the Philippines, in Macau, we've tested in Europe, we've tested in South America, but you have to have assurances that your collections are done well. So when you say, what's the biggest expense in anti-doping, to do it the right way, and really the only right way is to do it the way that we're doing it, and I'm not trying to look, you know, like I'm a big deal here, but that's really true, is the way that it's done in the Olympics and the way that we do it, it's really the only right way. You have to have it done the letter of the law, so to speak, and that's why we have all our policies online. But it's the collection, because if I have to send somebody to Argentina like we did with Lucas Matisse, it's going to cost more money than it is for me to test somebody in LA and then they can drive it to the Olympic lab at UCLA. It's a lot less money. But if you're doing large numbers of athletes and you have all the fighters, which I do believe all fighters that are registered with an athletic commission, a yearly license, should be in a year-round program. I don't think it's that hard to establish. I think it just takes somebody sitting down and doing it. I think that, you know, the UFC is starting to do that now with USADA. I think it can be done, but I think it takes the initiative of athletic commissions to band together, not just one state, but all states, to do it standardized.
It speaks to the need for a federal authority also overseeing this. It wouldn't solve the worldwide problem, but in the United States, you would have some kind of cohesive, you know, rules that would apply to everybody. Because some states have commissions but seldom do boxing. Some, like Nevada, do a lot of boxing. So, you know, the problem is that you do need that kind of central voice. I know I don't want to put you in a spot because I know you're a state's writer, but but you do need that, as you pointed out. You need that. You have to have some central authority to kind of oversee this.
Well, you do, but you know what? It's funny. When I was, even way before I thought about VADA, I started looking at horse racing and I fell in love with horses. I fell in love with Barbaro, that Kentucky Derby horse that got injured. And I started to see that horse racing is regulated exactly like boxing and MMA. It's all state commission controlled. But where horse racing is doing a better job than professional combat sports is they're understanding that in order to keep the fan base, in order to try to at least show that they care about the well-being of their athletes, which are not just the horses but the jockeys, they're implementing unified drug testing. And so I do believe that it can be done on a state-by-state basis if the jurisdictions, and a lot of these are tribal nations, if they would just work together to create a uniform system. Hey, you know, they created the uniform rules for fights.
Right.
So they could really do this, and even though, yeah, my pipe dream would be to have a national or federal commission, they could do this for this one entity. And I do believe that this is the hallmark of creating safety for the fighters, because all of these different issues, you know, and you and I have talked about the timing of the weigh-in and fighters cutting weight. We've talked about that ad nauseum, and I'm sure you guys talk about this a lot when you're looking at fighters coming in to fight on your cards on Showtime, is it all comes down to PEDs in the sense that if you would create a uniform system of drug testing, it could also be easily expanded to creating uniformity of medical tests, of who's fit to compete, who's not fit to compete, and all of this would create a safety barrier for the fighters, because I do believe that most athletes that, or fighters, let's look at fighters that turn to performance-enhancing methods and drugs, it's because they're either in the wrong weight class, they started in the wrong weight class in their amateur career, they're unhealthy, they're not fighting right, they developed eating disorders, they use they use their training camp as a fat farm, and so all of these things contribute to one another. And I think if there was uniformity in the testing and uniformity in an anti-doping program, you could envelop all these different entities and create a much safer sport. So
intriguing. Well, let me tell you something. This has been enlightening, and no one speaks about this topic with more conviction or more knowledge than you.
Too much conviction.
I want to remind people about VADA. They can go to your website. It's a voluntary anti-doping agency that provides education plus testing for fighters. How many fighters do you have approximately that are tested by you now?
We're not. We just ended up finishing Gonzalez and Pascal that fought on the card here last weekend. We've got about 4 other fighters that have contacted us to hopefully start their testing soon. And we're working with the World Boxing Council. You know, a lot of people are fond of sanctioning bodies, but I do believe that they're really trying to up their game. And I know the WBC has always been a big proponent of safety. We're working on a program with them for education of the fighters, and also they're going to be entering their top-rated fighters in a year-round program. So they've put together policies and procedures. They're soon to be available on the WBC website. We're soon going to have this webinar that anybody in the world can go to, even media, and learn about what is or isn't performance enhancing, how fighters are tested, what the actual procedure is for testing as far as urine and blood, what athletes will be going through. So we're trying to develop that so that that they've got maybe 200 fighters that are going to hopefully be in this program soon. So hopefully we'll be expanding. But the main thing is, like you said, education and talking about it, and I think it's going to be great.
All right, go to the VADA website if you want to learn more about what they're up to, and it will help you understand the questions about this issue in the sport of boxing, and it certainly is an issue. Now, I mentioned earlier, and I want to put up this information because I want to talk about this for a minute or two. I mentioned the novel that Margaret wrote, Death in Vegas, which is a fascinating novel because it's suspenseful. It's a fun plot. If you're a boxing fan, you'll like it. If you're even a casual boxing fan, it doesn't matter. You mentioned horse racing. There have been so many great mystery novels written surrounding horse racing that even if somebody's not a fan of that, they like to see it. The reviews of this are rave reviews from both people that professional reviewers as well as folks that writing in and giving their reviews. And How long did it take you to complete this? I remember when you were going through the throes of writing this, and you were in the process of tweaking it and having written books. I know how that goes. How long did it take you to complete this novel?
You know, it took probably about 2 years once I really started writing. And it's funny how your philosophy kind of evolves as you do something like this. I mean, the issues evolved. I wasn't really so much centering on performance-enhancing drugs, but as the story got going, I kind of saw that that was the tenet of what I was trying to put together. But, you know, I think the main thing that amazes me is, and you talk about this all the time so beautifully, I mean, you're such an aficionado, it's I love listening to you on air, is that there's so much to understand the intricacies of what's going on in a fight. I mean, it's so beautiful to look at all of the different, not just the physical aspects, the medical aspects, you know, what the referee and doctor is looking at. And so that was one thing I really wanted to go into in this book, because as I said earlier, I'm not Al Bernstein, so nobody would read my true life story, which maybe would also end me up at the bottom of Lake Mead. But
you need those bodyguards again.
That's why now I'll get the bodyguard. But at least I wanted people to understand what happens when you're making a decision during a fight. You know, what's the ring doctor looking at, what's the referee looking at, what they should be looking at, what they shouldn't be looking at, and how those things transpire. So I hope that more people do that, and I hope that non-boxing people or spouses of boxing people, that they want their spouse to get interested in the sport, will look at it, and so that they'll appreciate more of how beautiful it is. You know, they do all these movies which are terrific. You know, I guess their movie Southpaw is out, and it talks about all these sad things that a fighter goes through.
So depressing.
It sounds like it's depressing, you know. I mean, look at how depressing Raging Bull was in so many aspects. But at least it'll talk about the beauty of the sport, and you can develop more of an appreciation and a love of how great these fighters are and what they go through and what they give of themselves. And, you know, it's just a beautiful thing that you talk about so eloquently every week. So.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And the other thing I want to mention about your book is that for those folks that would want to look at it, there's great characterizations. It's not just, you know, we're talking about it as it relates to boxing.
And you helped me, so it's a little bit, you've helped me in so many ways, and you know that. So, you know, it's a lot of personal stuff in talking to you. So
you wrote the characters very well, and I thought I was drawn in. Forget the boxing part. I was drawn in by the characterizations and the story, the plot line. Not easy for someone who doesn't do that for a living. You're a doctor, okay? You know, you don't write novels for a living. And I'm going to tell everybody, and I mean this not just because we're friends and because I respect you a lot, for a first time out of the box novel, I defy anybody, and God knows I'm not a literary critic, even though I've written.
I wish you were the New York Times.
Hey, but you know what? For a first time out of the box, I defy anybody to point to a novel that was as entertaining or well written. It's very good. Now, you and I share so many interests, and before I let you go, you know, you several years ago got into horses, and you got into riding and equine, and I've been in that for many, many years, and it has provided you with a wonderful outlet, hasn't it?
You know, it really has. I mean, I'll tell you one sad thing is that my dressage horse has been drug tested much more than the average fighter. So, I mean, they have somebody sits, yeah, and somebody sits there with a cup. Can you imagine how hard that is?
Oh, jeez.
That would be expensive collection. Yeah.
It's very tough, but they come and they collect at the horse shows, and it's pretty impressive, you know. It's not like you can turn on a faucet and try to prompt them to pee, you know.
Yeah, so. And as if they weren't enough, one of the things I love about you is how eclectic you are, and I always respect that in people. And your father was involved in the music industry and was a very successful and prominent producer, and you actually studied to be a singer and performer and be in the entertainment world, and you love music. What was that trigger, though, that sent you so dramatically from that beginning to medicine?
I'll tell you a sad story. Is my father, his name was Nat Goodman, and he was wonderful. He worked with Sonny and Cher. He worked with Bill Medley. He worked for a time with Paul Anka. He worked with so many brilliant performers. He had a group called the Diamonds that did The Stroll and Little Darlin' for a long time. So my whole childhood was hanging out in nightclubs, a lot of lounges. I remember coming to Vegas to the Riviera and watching Shecky Green as like an 8-year-old when they didn't have the same rules.
And wasn't that educational for you?
Oh, wow, it really was. I remember going to the Playboy Club when the Diamonds would perform, and my dad would sit me at the bar, and the bunnies would take care of me till 4 a.m. So, but at any rate, my father, who was so talented and knew that I really wanted to be a singer, sat me down and said, "Honey, if you want to be Barbra Streisand, go be a doctor." So it was not going to happen. It was not going to happen in my lifetime. So, he said, do something where you can support yourself. And so that's how I ended up turning to medicine. But just like you, I love music, and I love musicals.
It's fun, and I know you, like me, like to belt out a tune from time to time. And I listen. It's a delight to have you do this. We'd love to have you back again, and maybe what we can do is, this was I think our opportunity to give people an overview and let them hear your viewpoints, and not just viewpoints, your insight and information, and help people understand a little bit this situation. And then maybe from time to time we can get you back to talk about as situations arise and some specifics.
That would be my honor. That'd be great.
Margaret, thank you so much. Thanks to Dan. Thank you for making this happen. We, you got all the technology figured out. You worked out the
what a nightmare.
Yeah. And it was great. Margaret, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you doing this.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. It's just an honor.
All right, and for all those folks out there that take a peek at this, we're going to continue to revisit this issue and stay up with it. And yes, go on the VADA website. Go check out all the information they have there, which will in fact, along with this conversation, give you some more information about all of this, because this is an issue in the sport, and it's something that we need to all deal with. We will see you next time on our Hangouts, and thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Dan, and we'll see you next time on Al Bernstein's Boxing Hangouts.